In 1891, a man named Daniel Burnham was handed what should have been an impossible assignment: build a city, not a temporary exhibition, a city, 200 buildings, 14 major structures the size of cathedrals, a working canal system, a functioning railway, a complete electrical grid, restaurants and hotels and theaters and museums, and a full working harbor, all of it, on a swamp on the south side of Chicago in 22 months. For context, the Empire State Building took 14 months to construct in 1930 with modern steel frame technology, electric cranes, and a workforce of over 7,000 men working in coordinated shifts around the clock, using pre-manufactured components designed specifically for fast assembly. The Empire State Building is one building. Burnham was given 22 months for 200, and he was told the buildings could not look like the Empire State Building. They had to look like ancient Rome. They had to have columns. They had to have ornate facades with detail carving that took master craftsmen months to complete per section. They had to have interior finishes, painted ceilings, marble floors, grand staircases. They had to look like they had been standing for centuries. And Burnham delivered. On May 1st, 1893, the gates of the world's Columbian Exposition opened in Chicago. 27 million people came. They called it the White City. They called it the most beautiful place in America. They called it proof that the United States had arrived as a civilization worthy of standing alongside the great empires of Europe. And almost nobody asked the question that should have stopped the entire official story cold. How? How did he build it? I want to give you a number: 14,000. That is the official count of workers on the White City construction project at its peak. 14,000 workers, 200 buildings, 22 months. Let us do the math that the official history of the Exposition has never done publicly. The Palace of Fine Arts, one of the 14 major structures, survives today as the Museum of Science and Industry in Chicago. It is 320,000 square feet of floor space. Its facade contains carved stone detailing that modern restoration contractors working on that same building have estimated requires approximately 40,000 hours of skilled labor per section. The building has 12 major facade sections. That is 480,000 hours of skilled stone carving labor for the facade alone of one building. Divide 480,000 hours by 22 months. That is 21,800 hours per month, required for the facade carving of the Palace of Fine Arts alone. Divide by 730 hours available per month per worker, and you need 30 skilled stone carvers working on that one building every single day for the entire construction period, doing nothing else. That is one building. There were 200. This is before you account for the foundations, the structural walls, the interior finishes, the electrical systems, the plumbing, the painted ceilings, the marble floors, the canal system, the railway, the 40 tons of copper wiring that was installed into buildings supposedly lasting 6 months. The math does not work. The 14,000 worker figure does not produce the White City in 22 months. It does not come close, and the people who built it knew it. Daniel Burnham kept a personal diary throughout the construction of the White City. That diary is in the archives of the Art Institute of Chicago. Most of what it contains is the standard record of a project manager dealing with logistics and personnel and deadlines. But there are 3 entries that do not fit the standard record, entries that the standard biographies of Burnham acknowledge exist but do not quote in full. The first is from April 1892, approximately 6 months into the construction period. Burnham writes that the pace of the work is unlike anything in his professional experience. Not that the work is progressing quickly, that the pace is unlike anything in his professional experience. a man who had spent his career building some of the largest structures in Chicago, finding the pace of this project unlike anything he had encountered before. The second entry is from November 1892, approximately 14 months into the construction period. He writes that certain of the older structures are responding to cleaning and treatment in ways that suggest the underlying material is of a different character than the surface application. Certain of the older structures, not the newer structures, the older ones, the ones already there, responding to cleaning and treatment, not responding to construction, responding to cleaning. The third entry is from February 1893, approximately 3 months before the Exposition opened. He writes simply that he does not believe they built the White City. He believes they revealed it. He does not elaborate. The entry ends there. He does not elaborate. He believes they revealed it. A man who managed the entire construction project of the most celebrated architectural achievement in American history, writing privately in his personal diary 3 months before it opened that he does not believe they built it. Now I want to take you to the photographs, because the photographic record of the White City construction is one of the most extensively documented construction projects of the 19th century. The fair's official photographer, Charles Dudley Arnold, took thousands of photographs throughout the construction period. Those photographs are in the Art Institute of Chicago, and they have been extensively reproduced in books about the Exposition. What they show is not what you would expect to see. In a normal major construction project, the photographic record shows stages. You see foundations. You see structural frames going up. You see walls at partial height. You see roof lines being completed before interiors are finished. You see the sequential logic of construction that anyone who has watched a large building go up understands intuitively. The White City photographs do not show this. What they show is buildings appearing to emerge from scaffolding, already substantially complete, not partially constructed, already substantially complete. The scaffolding in the photographs is not the scaffolding of construction. It is the scaffolding of finishing work applied to structures that are already structurally whole. There are almost no photographs in the entire collection showing the White City buildings in early construction stages, foundations being laid, walls at partial height, the structural skeleton visible before the facade. Researchers who have studied the photographic archive have noted this absence. The standard explanation is that Arnold was commissioned to document the finished exposition, not the construction process, and therefore focused his photography on the complete or near complete buildings. This explanation is possible. It is also completely convenient, because what the photographic record does not show is precisely what would definitively establish whether these buildings were constructed from scratch in 22 months, or whether they were something else that was being finished and prepared for opening. Here is where the story requires you to think about something you probably already know but have never connected to this. The world's Columbian Exposition was held in Chicago in 1893. It was held on the south side of Chicago in an area called Jackson Park. Jackson Park before the Exposition was a swamp, a literal swamp. Low-lying land on the shore of Lake Michigan that was regularly flooded and considered essentially unusable for construction. The official story says Olmsted designed a drainage and landscape plan that transformed the swamp into viable construction land, and that construction then proceeded on the transformed site. But here is what the engineering history of that transformation has never adequately explained. You cannot build the foundation systems visible in the White City photographs on a swamp that has been drained for less than a year. Foundation engineering on reclaimed marshy land requires the ground to settle and stabilize. The soil compression and water displacement that produces stable ground for major construction takes years. minimum 3 to 5 years for the kind of load-bearing foundations that would support buildings of the scale visible at the White City. The official timeline gives Olmsted approximately 8 months to transform the swamp and then allows construction to begin on foundations that should not have been structurally viable for years afterward. Modern geotechnical engineers who have examined this question have noted that the foundation stability visible in the Exposition photographs is inconsistent with the official timeline for site preparation. What is consistent with the foundation stability in those photographs is ground that had been stable for much longer than 8 months, ground that had been stable long enough to support major construction, ground that already had things built on it. Now, let me take you to the demolition, because the demolition of the White City is where the official story has its most serious problem, and it is where a man whose name almost nobody knows said something that should have ended the standard narrative permanently. The world's Columbian Exposition closed on October 30th, 1893. Within weeks, demolition began on the temporary structures. By the following summer, most of the major buildings had been torn down. The process was documented by workers and journalists and city officials. And in that documentation, there are accounts that do not fit the story of temporary plaster buildings being demolished after a 6-month exhibition. Workers reported finding interior spaces inside the walls that should not have existed if the walls were solid staff construction, not structural voids, not air gaps for insulation, interior spaces, rooms, finished spaces, inside walls that the official record described as solid plaster and jute fiber construction 3 to 4 feet thick. One account collected in a 1947 academic paper on the demolition describes a foreman named Thomas Kelleher who supervised the demolition of 3 of the major structures. Kelleher told the paper's author that his crews found the same thing in all 3 buildings. The outer surface was the described staff material, but behind the staff at varying depths, the workers encountered something different, a harder underlying layer, a layer that required different tools and more force to break through, a layer whose composition Kelleher described as unlike any construction material he had worked with in 30 years of building and demolition in Chicago. Kelleher's account appears once in the 1947 paper. It is never referenced again in any subsequent academic work on the Exposition. The paper itself has been out of print for decades, but the statement is there for anyone who finds it. A man with 30 years of professional construction experience encountering something inside the walls of the White City that he could not identify from any construction tradition he knew. Here is what that means when you put it with Burnham's diary entries and the photographic anomalies and the impossible construction timeline. The White City was not built between 1891 and 1893. What happened between 1891 and 1893 was something different. The structures that became the White City were already there, already standing, already substantially complete in their underlying form. What Burnham's workforce actually did in those 22 months was not construct buildings from the ground up. It was clear the site, stabilize and repair existing structures, apply the staff surface material to existing walls, finish the interiors, install the electrical system and the plumbing and the copper conductor network, lay the floors, paint the ceilings, and open the gates. This is what Burnham meant when he wrote that he does not believe they built the White City. He believes they revealed it. He was the project manager. He knew what his workforce actually did during those 22 months. And what they actually did was not consistent with constructing 200 major buildings from scratch. It was consistent with preparing 200 pre-existing structures for public exhibition. And when the exhibition was over and the structures were demolished, the demolition workers found what was left when you stripped away the surface preparation. the underlying structures that Burnham's workers had found and prepared and surfaced and presented to 27 million people as something brand new built by American industry in 22 months, as proof of what the United States could achieve. Proof of American capability built on top of something that was already there, something older, something that nobody was supposed to look at too carefully, something that the demolition was supposed to make disappear permanently. The copper is the part that nobody explains satisfactorily. 40 tons of copper wiring was installed in the White City. 40 tons. In buildings that were going to be demolished in 6 months. The copper alone cost $120,000 in 1893 money, nearly $4 million in today's money for temporary buildings. But here is the question that number raises that nobody asks. If the buildings were temporary structures built from plaster and fiber, why did they require 40 tons of copper wiring? Standard lighting for an exhibition space does not require 40 tons of copper. The Chicago World's Fair used 12,500 kilowatt-hours of electricity per day. The power plant built for the Exposition had a documented capacity of 8,000 kilowatts. The gap between what the power plant could produce and what the Exposition consumed is 4,500 kilowatt-hours per day, every day, for the entire duration of the Exposition, coming from somewhere that is not the documented power plant. The copper conductor network running through those 4-foot walls was not installed to support the exhibition lighting. Something was already running through those walls, and the copper installation was connecting to whatever that something was. When the demolition happened, the copper was removed first. Before the structural demolition began, it was pulled out of the walls systematically and sold for scrap. Workers were specifically instructed to document and preserve all copper before any structural demolition proceeded. You do not instruct demolition workers to carefully document and preserve scrap copper from temporary exhibition buildings unless the copper is not simply scrap from temporary exhibition buildings. The copper was removed first because whoever ordered the demolition understood what it was and did not want it left in the rubble where someone might examine it carefully and ask what it was connected to. And this brings us back to the last demolition worker, not Kelleher, the last one, the man who was present at the final stages of demolition in the summer of 1894. His name was Raymond Lester, and he worked for the Chicago Wrecking Company that held the demolition contract for the remaining structures after the fire that destroyed several buildings in July 1894. Lester gave one documented account of his work on the demolition in a letter to his nephew in 1931. The letter survived in the nephew's family and was donated to the Chicago History Museum in 1978. It is in the archive. It is accessible. And what Lester writes in that letter about what he found in the final stages of demolition is the most direct statement in any documented source about what the White City actually was. He writes that when they got through the outer layer on the last standing major structure, they found walls that no construction crew had built in 1891 or any other recent year. He writes that the stone beneath the plaster surface was fitted in ways he had not seen in any building constructed in his lifetime, that the joints were tight in a way that modern construction did not produce, that the underlying structure felt to him like something much older than the Exposition. He writes that he mentioned this to his foreman. His foreman told him to keep working and keep quiet. He writes that he kept quiet for 37 years, and then he wrote it to his nephew because he was an old man and he did not want to die without telling someone what he had actually found inside those walls. Raymond Lester died in 1934. His letter sat in a family collection for 47 years before it went to the Chicago History Museum. It has been in the archive since 1978. It has never been cited in any academic work on the world's Columbian Exposition. The 1947 paper referencing Kelleher's account has never been republished. Burnham's diary entries about the older structures and his belief that they revealed, rather than built, the White City are acknowledged in his standard biographies and never quoted in full. The photographic record showing buildings already substantially complete in their earliest documented construction photographs has been explained by the focus of the official photographer and never examined as an anomaly. The copper removal protocol has never been explained by any account of the demolition. The electrical consumption gap has been attributed to efficient generation and never investigated further. Each piece of this story has been handled individually and explained away individually. And what makes each individual explanation seem plausible is that none of the pieces are ever examined together. Because when you examine them together, what you get is not a construction project. What you get is a preparation project. What you get is 27 million Americans visiting a city that had already been there, seeing structures their official guides told them had been built in 22 months by American workers as proof of American greatness, walking through buildings that a demolition worker 37 years later would describe as feeling like something much older than the Exposition, being told they were witnessing the achievement of their civilization, when what they were actually witnessing was a stage set, constructed over something much older, shown to them by people who understood exactly what was underneath and had very specific reasons for not saying so. The White City was demolished. The underlying structures were destroyed, along with the surface preparation. The fire of July 1894 removed several buildings before the demolition crews arrived. The remaining structures were taken down through 1894. The copper was removed first. The site was cleared. Jackson Park was re-landscaped. The Palace of Fine Arts alone was preserved, and that preservation has given us the only surviving example of what these structures actually were underneath the staff surface. If you go to the Museum of Science and Industry in Chicago today, you can walk through a building that started its modern life as an exposition structure in 1893. You can look at the masonry. You can look at the foundation. You can ask the guide when it was built. They will tell you 1893, and they will be telling you the truth as the official record presents it. But if you look carefully at the walls, if you look at the quality of the stone, if you look at the precision of the joints, and if you remember what Raymond Lester wrote to his nephew in 1931 after 37 years of keeping quiet, you will understand that 1893 is not the complete answer. It is simply the answer we have been given. And the complete answer is still there in the walls, if anyone is willing to look at them the way Raymond Lester did, and tell what they actually see.